Hello everyone, I'm Eric Fausner, the Executive Online Editor of the Golden Gate University School of Law Review, and I'm sitting down today with Sylvia Nguyen of Golden Gate University on her article about why we should never prosecute juveniles as adults. Thanks for joining me, Sylvia.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I thought your paper raised a lot of issues, and juveniles is something that doesn't get addressed very often during law school. So what is it that inspired you in ethical prosecutions to write about this issue?
Well, I guess what first inspired me was working on a case at the public defender's office. A 14-year-old was being tried as an adult, and it was really heartbreaking. It had to do with gangs, and this kid just grew up in a really harsh environment. And not that it justifies anything that he was alleged of doing, but it just really makes you think about what these juveniles have to go through, the kind of environment they live in, and their inability to not think things through and think about consequences. And whether I guess it just got me thinking about it, and it's hard to put that kid convict that kid, knowing that he probably didn't even think about what he was doing and all the consequences. And he probably still, even after conviction, he probably wouldn't even know or fully understand the consequences of his actions. And yeah, it just got me thinking about why juveniles. It also made me think about how juveniles are, I guess, how do you say it? They have the highest chance of rehabilitation, and to throw them into jail and just essentially throw their lives away. That's just a waste of another potentially good human being that we could have.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting in your article is that you just flat out say never charge juveniles as adults. And I think that's interesting mainly because of how rare juveniles being prosecuted as adults is. Now in your paper you say that it's 1 in 100 juveniles are charged as adults. So what would you say to those who say that why it's not a big problem, this doesn't happen very often, why does that one life out of 100 matter?
It matters because if that's one person's life you can change, you can only imagine all the lives that one life can even change thereafter. And we don't really I don't think Americans really seem to think about that fully. Our prisons are overcrowded, and people's lives can be changed every single day. And if their lives are changed, they can change so many other lives after that. So saving one kid's life, I think, is worth that change.
Now, another statistic you pointed to was the rate of suicide of juveniles who are charged and subsequently jailed as adults. It's 7 times more likely that they will try to kill themselves than it is in a juvenile detention facility. Why do you think that is?
Well, I also point out in my paper one of the main arguments for juveniles being tried as adults, that it should be considered a cruel and unusual punishment. And when these juveniles are placed into adult facilities, things like sexual assaults, rape, and abuse become even more possible, I guess, because that they're in there. And people in adult prisons usually try to aim at younger inmates, and so that's why the suicide rate is that much higher in juveniles.
One of the arguments you make in your paper is one that you don't often see in legal scholarly works, which is a socioeconomic argument of why charging juveniles as adults is wrong. Could you explain why there's a desperate impact on people of lower socioeconomic class with charging juveniles as adults?
I think it's a really big factor that should be considered, because who you are as a person now is thanks to how you were raised and what kind of environment you were raised in, the people who raised you, and what your surroundings were when you were growing up. And it's important because people of a lower socioeconomic class, they're not afforded things like after-school daycare, after-school programs, even city or club sports or things like that. Every little thing costs money, and if you're from a neighborhood that doesn't have those kinds of things, your kids, all these kids are more likely to be just roaming around on the streets and just getting into trouble. And it seems so simple, but it seems to be overlooked constantly every day.
So do you feel that this is just one more way that the system seems to favor those who have the means over those who don't?
I definitely think so. It's sad because it really does just come down to money and what people can afford. If you can afford to have your kids involved in sports and other different types of activities, that's a big chunk of time that's not going to go to for them to be able to just do whatever they want or be influenced by other kids that are doing other things that may be right or wrong. And another statistic that I had actually come across is that most juveniles that get into trouble, it's usually between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. And those are the hours of after school and before parents usually come home from work. So I think that plays a big role in that too.
Sylvia, I think that the solutions you propose for these problems make a lot of sense. There's only 3 of them, but I think in conjunction they could make a difference. And the first one was that the maximum jail time for youth offenders should stay the same, but there'd be a youth offender panel at the end that would determine whether or not they could be released into society. The second solution you had was a separate facility for the most violent juvenile offenders, murderers of the first degree with no mitigating circumstances. Mm-hmm. And then your last solution was to maybe change the paradigm and create a maximum limit to the amount of years a juvenile offender can serve versus just aging out of the system. So could you please talk a little bit about these solutions and how you think they can help?
For the youth offender panel, that's my favorite of the 3. There's actually some countries, I believe in the UK or somewhere in Europe, they actually have a youth offender panel. That's where I got the idea from. And what that consists of is basically psychologists, teachers, mental health experts. They have these group of people who assess whether a juvenile is ready to be released into society, basically a year before their term is up. And I think it was a great idea because at the end of the day, we want to see whether these juveniles are able to be productive society members and if they're going to be okay, if they felt remorse, if they learned from their lessons. And having this youth offender panel will actually protect society still and make sure that we're not letting just anyone back out into the real world. But it also gives these juveniles a chance to be able to show that they're ready to come back. And I think that alone would be a really good solution. The other 2 was having a separate facility for the worst juvenile offenders. And that's probably unrealistic just because then it costs money and putting them into an entirely new facility or something would be a little far-fetched. I guess that one is just more to help people, I guess put the people who worry the most at ease. Everyone's always talking about what about the worst murderers and what about those kids that they don't even care what they did and blah, blah, blah. So I guess that would, put them at ease. And the last one, for changing the statutory limit to actually a number of years instead of having juveniles age out of the system, I think that would make sense too. Right now in California, the limit for a juvenile to stay in a facility is up until they're 23. And that concerns a lot of people, especially because if they committed the crime when they were 17 or something, they get out within just 6 years. And so maybe a solution to that would be just have a maximum of 10 years or 5 years, actual sentencing terms where the limit is maybe around 10 years. I think that would be more reasonable. And it also would be more proportionate to whatever crime they committed as well. But at least that gives them an opportunity to still be able to have a life after being released.
Now, for those students who want to take Professor Cambry's ethical prosecutions class, what words of wisdom would you impart onto those students?
I would say you don't have to be a prosecutor or want to be a prosecutor to take the class, and just be open-minded. I want to go into criminal defense, and nothing about that class ever changed my mind, but it really opened my eyes to the responsibilities that a district attorney or a prosecutor has, and I appreciate how difficult certain decisions would be for them to make, and I think taking that class has helped me become more open-minded to working with a prosecutor and being more cooperative with them. So I would say definitely stay open-minded.
Sylvia, I think your article has a lot of great ideas in it, and I think that it's going to start a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.